We are back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. In these episodes, guests get to share their journey of successes and setbacks with a primary focus of how they've overcome specific issues that otherwise could have disrupted their accessibility journey. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Sara Nilsson. Sara, thank you so much. Hi.
Yeah,
Um, Very happy to have you on today's episode.
yes, thank you for having me. My name is Sara. I live right now in San Francisco, but I'm actually from Brazil. I moved to the US about 8 years ago, and now I'm a software engineer, full stack for Zillow.
Incredible. When I was getting to know you a little bit, you had shared a little bit about how you got into accessibility. So let's start there. I always love to um, get to know your journey, how you got into accessibility, how you've grown as a leader in the space.
Yeah. So my story with accessibility started a long time ago when I was 16. I actually started meeting a person that was deaf, and we became good friends, and we would go out, and I at the time I didn't know the language very well, but I was very committed to communicating, and I started learning really quickly how to sign. And sometimes like he would ask me for help, like, oh, could you help me go to the, I don't know, to the phone store, and then to get something resolved, because he just like couldn't communicate very well with them. So yeah, for deaf people, written language, like example English or Portuguese, is not their first language. Their first language is signs. So with that in mind, and like, yeah, not a lot of places like offer that the ability for them to communicate with, in their first language. So yeah, I think it's really difficult. Some of them, it's kind of like excluded from their families in a way, because like they just don't know how to handle it. They just don't know how to communicate. Schools doesn't know what to do with them a lot of times. So everything is like so much more work to get resolved. And at the time, I felt very frustrated with the situation. And at the same time, I felt really happy that I was able to give and like help the community. So I started being very included in like going to events and meeting deaf people. And then at work, I worked with, customers. And sometimes like we did a lot of documentation, like marriage, birth certificates, things like that, which is like very important and everybody needs. So it's a very like common service for people to get. And sometimes like deaf people would come, and then they like, it's already like a little shy because they know they're gonna have to go through the process of not being understood. So that's when I would come in and someone would call me like, hey Sara, like there's a deaf person, like can you go there and talk to them? Because at the time I was learning, I was like, okay, I'll go. So then later they would feel so like welcome, and they would feel so excited. Like it was very clear. They were just like, what? Like you signed? Like they were so like, excited about the idea of getting the help they needed in their language, and not having to write down on paper, or, like having all these like challenges to just like do simple things, just getting a document or something. So that's when it started. And then I think that experience made me very empathetic with that community specifically. But then I moved to the US a couple years after, and I kind of left that behind because Brazilian Sign Language just worked in Brazil. So then when I came here, I was like, okay, American Sign Language, like, should I learn that too? But I was already learning English, and then I was like, "Ah, maybe I'll keep that for the side right now." And then I did nanny for some years, and then I got into coding. And the reason I got into coding was because my partner, he works as a UX software engineer, and he was like, oh, there's the need for people that think about accessibility in the tech world. Like there's just like the same type of people, the same type of thinking. So I think you'd be a great fit to just like bring something new. And I thought that was interesting, but I had no idea what that meant because first of all, I was not very familiar with computers. I was never the person to to like be very familiar, or everything was so new, it was so challenging. But then passing forward, when I got my internship at Zillow, I they asked me like, what are your interests, and I was like, accessibility, whatever that means. For the website. And they're like, okay, cool. You know what? We have some tickets here that have been in the backlog for a long time. They're basically like tickets that came from an audit. And what is an audit, right? Like, I was just like, okay, sounds nice. And they're like, yeah, we basically need to make the website more accessible. So here's like color contrast issues that we need to fix. There's like all of those things that you need to think about when you're writing the code. And if you don't, it just like, it just doesn't work properly. So at the time, I didn't know much. And then I started like learning and fixing the issues, and that gave me a little bit of good understanding. And then after that, I just like, and then it started increasing, and then I started like focusing on automation testings for our team, and like just like implementing automation testing for pipelines, and like how can we catch this earlier? Like what are the things we can do? Can we have a pre-commit or something that kind of catch that catch that catch those violations early on, because I just like, it's very frustrating when you have to go back to the code and you don't even remember anymore, and like fixing things. So yeah, I was like doing everything I could to kind of like introduce that idea to my team, and then they saw that I was very passionate, so then I kept asking for more challenges, and then I decided to learn how to do an audit on the page. And that's when I really like learned, because I was like, okay, I need to divide this in sections because there's so much. There's like
Yeah.
keyboard navigation, like there's screen readers, there's so much, and I was just like overwhelmed a little bit, but having fun. So I create a little system for myself of like, okay, here's the things that I always gonna check, and there's so much resources out there. And then I learned more about the web content guidelines. Yeah, so it was a long journey, and I'm still trying to every day do something about it. Like today, I did help someone on how to have an ARIA label, well descriptive. So like small things like that.
Yeah. I mean, you've shared in a long journey, met several years, right? A very interesting story, and you're one of several folks that I've spoken to where a personal connection to someone
Hmm.
or themselves having a lived disability is actually what got them into thinking and being passionate about accessibility. So I love where you started. You had indicated like there was when you're going to get your birth certificate and your passport and other documents, right? There's like a lack of accommodation, and
Hmm.
personally, from what I see in the market, there still is a lack of accommodation, especially when we're speaking digitally. So much of what's been focused on is around compliance, and I think you and I, why we kind of hit it off originally, was because we talked about the usability of a product, right, and the ability to have a fluid experience, so that instead of feeling not understood,
Hmm.
there's a sense of smiling and belonging, and
Hmm.
um, that excitement that, I mean, for the opening part of what you shared, I was getting excited, but you mentioned that you're like, yeah, people get you're able to deliver a level of excitement because you created that connection, right?
Hmm. Yes.
um it's kind of funny that you started in the journey of dealing in the backlog. um I would think, and kudos to Zillow, to how mature the accessibility strategy has gotten to. But
Hmm.
I think 9 times out of 10 companies, if you ask like how are you addressing accessibility, it's probably through a backlog. um which is challenging. So fast forward, you got to automation, right? And I think that's being able to develop code that's accessible from the get-go and not have to do all types of manual testing is great.
Yeah.
What are the challenges that you still see then today? Like where are some of the challenges that you're trying to tackle? You
Um,
mentioned a simple
yeah,
one of helping someone write an ARIA label, but I'm curious, like very
yeah,
macro level.
so as you mentioned about, okay, there's still like we're sometimes we think more like, um, how can we do the minimum that would be good enough for people to just be able to use this application? Or it's not about like the best. It's not about like be as inclusive as possible. It's like
Yeah.
how can we not get sued?
I don't know. I'm just thinking like you kind of said minimal, and I'm like, well, we always build minimal viable product, or I
Right,
think there was
right.
a better term now, but I guess that's how do you deliver something that's good, but
Yeah.
is skateboard before we get to a car, right?
Right. So for example, sometimes like yes, there are decorative things on the page and we don't want to, tell that to the user. But then why not? Like if the person that uses a screen reader, why can they not have the same experience, right? Like of like let's describe exactly what is happening in the photo. I want them to have as close as possible of that experience that we that have sight have. So that goes more like, like future of like the perfect world. But the challenge that I face right now that I think I would be very good to resolve, it's like manual testings that I do. So I spend a lot of time with screen readers, manual testing, the keyboard navigation, focus. Is everything clickable? Does the icons that are links, do they focus correctly? Because sometimes the designers and the developers only think about how it looks, not how it functions. So that's a challenge. And then sometimes I feel frustrated because if I don't review every merge request, every code that is front end related, sometimes I'm afraid like I'm gonna miss something if because we don't have that coverage on
Mm.
testing. And then I wrote like documentations and things for helping people to understand how they can do this by themselves and things like that. And I keep being an advocate for people to do the manual testing, but I understand it's like it's painful sometimes. But I think, yeah, not having that invested in terms of, okay, I just want to an automation test that goes through the page and making sure everything, is in the right order, everything is being read correctly, and there are the human judgment sometimes too of like what makes the most sense, to be displaying for users that depends on assistive technology. But yeah, I think I would love to have more automation testing for sure.
Would you say that also impedes like the scale of what can be covered?
Yes, like right now we do have automation tests, right? Like we
Yeah.
are able to catch things like, oh, this is, I don't know, like a drop down and it's missing a row, it's missing something, or this is like a form and you need to enter, there's a field, an input field, and then you need to make sure there's a label associated with it, otherwise the person doesn't know. So because you can make, for example, oh, enter your name and then have a little box, but then for some people that use assistive technology, like a screen reader, maybe the name label is not associated with that box, and then it's just like there's a lack of understanding for the
Yeah.
person that's going through the page. So we can catch those things. We also have like components, shared components, a Zillow, that it's a whole team. They make sure accessibility is good. You can always ask questions. You can report bugs. I'm always like, I'm always reporting bugs, and I'm like, oh, because they're so nice and they love to make it more accessible as possible. So I don't feel shy. I just like, hey, another one.
Well, I mean, the advocacy and the championship that you're focused on from an accessibility front, right? Like, especially when you have a team that's building the component library that's so widely used.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. So, how do you prioritize what to automate or what to kind of try to get out of manual testing and or things that aren't covered? Like, is there a framework that you use, or what's the methodology where like, okay, this is where I'm going to put my brain to next?
So I really would like to explore what was the name Playwright. I believe there is a chance that I was thinking to experiment. I haven't done much research because I didn't have a time yet to focus on
Time
that.
is
I wish.
probably, yeah, part of the prioritization
Mm-hmm.
challenge.
Yep. But I was thinking, oh, what if I could? I know that Playwright can automate tasks. For example, you go through a page and you start like tabbing, and then you start like doing things. And what if I could kind of record that with Playwright? And this is the flow that needs to follow. And then when someone adds a feature, adds a button, adds anything, I want to fail. And then they have to go and just add, okay, now it also needs to make sure that this button is being selected. It also needs to make sure that this is going through, that the outline looks good. Um, Very focused on, like the specifically for keyboard navigation and screen readers, I think are the two main things that I would love to automate.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, because yeah, it's like, the foundation, I would say. Because yeah, when those two things are working well, that means that like things that are on the accessibility tree are in the proper order, they're being labeled correctly, they have the right semantics, yeah, things like that. And there's still gonna be some lack of, like judgment, human judgment, I would say. But it's a good start, I would say.
This is totally random, but I feel no, I well, it's not random, but like it goes back to something you were saying earlier. So your friend in Brazil that you
Yeah.
helped with from a sign language perspective, right? Do you still
Hmm.
keep in touch with this person?
Um, no.
Well,
Oh,
that was an oxymoron. Hold on. Do you pen
it was a
pal?
love
Like
story.
what? Oh, okay.
A love story. Um, we don't talk anymore.
Yeah. Well, I
But
hope
it was interesting because I actually fell in love with the idea of him being different. And yeah, like, I
got
don't know,
it.
it was very romantic to kind of like go on walks and he's just like, oh, a butterfly. Things
Huh.
like that. So it was very sweet. And he was a
Yeah.
really good person. I think the only problem was because I moved.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, it's just different,
Well, yeah, I
goals.
mean, I'm just still like, I don't know, I write notes while we have these conversations and I'm always like looking back and I'm like, I'm still fixated
Yeah,
on the fact of like how you got into this and now um talking
but
about
yeah,
automating the a
I
fairly
actually.
sophisticated part of navigation, and it's like it's cool like how the inspiration and journey kind of
Yeah, that's
carried through.
interesting because I often think about him and I'm like, oh, he would be so proud of me.
Yeah.
Because I remember some people judge me at the time. They were like, oh, you're just like into sign language because you're liking this boy. And I was like, no, it's not just about that. I swear, like I actually really like it and I
What
really want to help. And I kind of was able to make that part of what I do as a full time in a very different way than I expected
yeah.
because I thought I would do sign language or something. But technology is just like, like as you, millions of people are using the website every day. And then one thing I miss is that personal connection of like knowing their reaction. So if they do feel welcome, if they do feel like, whoa, there's like, I can navigate with my keyboard, how do they feel? Like, how do I never had the experience of like knowing their challenge, like in a one-on-one or doing this like testing.
Yeah.
It would be really, really cool.
Yeah, I mean the areas of measurement for success, right? Like quantitative metrics for
Hmm.
accessibility, I think is something still that's
That's true.
a big gap. I've spoken to several folks who are like, well, if we see increased shopping cart or increased views on a particular home or more people
Mhm.
requesting to see the home, right? Like I'm sure Zillow has tons of core metrics that you look at. But when it
Yeah.
gets down to accessibility, like more dollars doesn't mean always you're doing a better job or it doesn't mean better satisfaction. So
That's a
Maybe
good
when you master all of this testing and automation,
yeah.
figuring out how to take that delight that you were able to get from providing the acknowledgement, we need to figure that out. Like that's the code to crack, because I talk to so many people who are like, what's the ROI of this? And I'm like, well, very good and hard question. And the desire to look at it from media effectiveness and CSAT and MPS and otherwise. But then it's like, well, what if the CSAT and MPS that you use isn't acceptable, accessible?
Mm-hmm.
So you've shared a lot of the great wins. What do you have a particular setback or set of setbacks that you tend to reflect back on?
What did that mean? Like things that I regret or just
Or
done
not even
differently?
regrets, but like technological setbacks, or I've heard from other people like, well, they cut funding, and that really was challenging because our team went from one to many to one. But like, I'm curious, you know,
Mm-hmm.
what are
Um,
some of the challenges that you've had to
yeah.
overcome? I mean, you're talking a lot about the lack of automation, but I think that's as much an opportunity, right?
I think you mentioned like priority. It's one of them.
Yeah.
Uh, it's the biggest one, I would say. And I think also not having an standardized sort of a way of, okay, so if you work on front end, you have to test the keyboard navigation. Like that's part of your job. That's what you do. Like you're creating interactive, elements on the page, and why not to test with the keyboard and things that seem so simple, but it's not reinforced.
Yeah.
And then we do have this rule of like, oh, okay, so we follow, the web content accessibility guidelines, double A, so two dot something. I don't remember the numbers now, but there is like a version.
2.2 is where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah, 2.1. I think we try to follow 2.1, 8 double A. So like that's
Yep.
the standard. But how, like, where is the resource for us to like make sure that we're not shipping things without an audit, for example, like an accessibility audit, or making sure that we're writing tests that covers accessibility. We write tests for the functionality only for users, the majority, but there's this like small groups that's kind of like left out. And it's interesting to me because sometimes I feel like, wow, people feel such like a strong feeling when something goes wrong in production, in the website. When something breaks, people get so upset or like so nervous, and I'm just like, well, there's a lot of things broken that also affects people. It's just like, but sometimes the number is what mattered the most.
Well,
uh
it's hard to quantify. Like, I don't know that there's an
we don't
easy
even
way to
know. Yeah.
measure how many people
That's
use it.
interesting. Yeah, because I recently, my team was like, oh, it's so crazy. So many users use Safari. And I was like, yes, because if you have an iPhone and you have a disability, like there's tons of features that work so well with Safari, in your phone. So
Yeah.
it makes sense to me that so again, the data, like where's the data about people that needs accessibility?
So, what are the biggest disruptions that are going to come to accessibility?
What do you mean?
So, disruptions could be something that is brings us forward in a quantum way, right?
Mhm.
And I hear a lot like, well, AI is going to change accessibility, and I'm not going to let you off the hook just to say that, because I think we got to be a little more specific. Or a setback could be actually a change in regulation that doesn't hold brands or companies accountable, right? Like disruption could go good or bad, but
That's interesting. So what would make like us move forward with accessibility? Probably laws, but I think more than laws is like if we had the data, I think about, imagine if now we know that 90% of our users only use keyboard. They don't use, like, let's say, in a I'm creating a world where people,
right,
most
I'm
people
there.
just use the keyboard. um and then now we're like, oh damn, like we have the data, like we need to improve this. The same thing happened to Safari because like we weren't paying as much attention to how our website was looking on Safari, and turns out like there's so many users that are using that browser. So then we start being more alert because yeah, more users, the more we know, the more we want to improve those areas. So I think sometimes we hear so much for like the product aspect of like, okay, so users want this feature, agents want this, they want to be able to do that. So I think it's not clear as much, I think, as like the plan, for the companies of like what it needs to happen. So I think a great way would be if we have like someone exposing that more, and then companies being more aware that is actually a way for them to gain money.
Yeah, well,
Profit.
and loyalty, money, loyalty.
Yeah.
I was reading some statistics about the younger generations, the Gen Z. Where are we at now? I mean, 24 to 36 year olds, right?
Uh,
And one of the areas that this consumer base really values is an inclusive brand, and part of
mhm,
that inclusivity is around accessibility. And so, I know that you said, well, law is going to make it work or drive it forward, but I think until penalties actually become something of magnitude, right? Because a few $100,000, I hate to say it, to a brand that's making hundreds of millions, billions, or a few $100,000 fine is sort of like a cost of doing business. The
mhm,
best is when you hear that there is a top down and a bottom up collaboration around accessibility, but the consumer base, and it's the growing audience of most sites, right, or the growing
mhm,
audience of the internet, and digital content. The sheer fact that if a brand is in the news around my dog is actually now just going to come on to the podcast. His nose, get out of here, buddy. That's how he's like, it's such a good conversation. What I was saying, and I was rambling, was the fact that the brand's image is probably more important than the
mhm,
legality issue. And a brand image is everything, because once you lose a customer, it's gone. But from what I hear, I mean, it sounds like Zillow is a pretty amazing place when it comes to accessibility. I mean, you have to be, right? And you have a dual sided audience. You have the agents, you have and you have the homeowner. I'm sure, more even user personas than just that, where it sounds like things are going really well. Your challenges, where the opportunities are. If we leave today's conversation, what is the one major impression that you want everyone to walk away with? What's the one takeaway?
mhm. I think what helps me to have that empathy to other people that might not have the ability, to use a website in the same way that I do, is to think of a moment where you felt unable or uninvited or excluded. Because to me, that's the sensation. It's like, oh, if you have a limitation and you don't get to experiment that thing, um, it's sad. So I think it's so exciting how advanced we are in technology, but at the same time, I think what I would like to people to take away with it is like, oh, why we have so much knowledge, we have so much technology, why not think of ways that we can include everyone? And I don't think it takes that much effort. I think it's just like we can do that gradually. And I think, yeah, still like working in inclusion, just like putting more all types of people in tech, I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, well, you hit, and one of the things you called out, it was a little bit of a learned empathy for you. But if we all could practice a little bit more empathy when it
Yeah,
comes
correct.
to everyone around us,
Yeah.
and the other aspect, and the huge takeaway for me was, think about accessibility when you're writing code, right? The hardest thing and the most challenging thing when I talk to other brands is like, well, we test at the end of the development lifecycle. Like, it's like, we're looking at thing. Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, I'm pulling my hair out, and my hairline, you can see, is already receding. So it's like, it's crazy that, like, it's so much simpler to address the problem when you look at the methodology from the get-go. So,
Yeah.
Sarah, I want to say thank you so much. The ease of conversation, and the sheer excitement and energy that you bring to this topic is
I'm tired.
inspiring.
That was like 50%. No
Oh,
kidding.
then we'll cut this and we'll redo it with 100% energy.
Invite me on a
Thank you.
Saturday, then you see.
Well, thank you so much for
Thank
coming on today's
you.
episode
Yeah.
and sharing everything that you're doing to make Zillow so great.
Yeah, I'm very excited. Thank you so much. I was so excited when you messaged me because I was like, oh my God, a company that is like doing the amazing job. Yeah, I'm very excited to learn more about your company too. Give
Yes,
me the
that's part
details.
two. Thank you.
Okay, bye.